Hello, everyone. We're here with the magnificent, marvelous Nick Bascom. What was the whole thing, sort of this though?
Oh yeah, she says, I think it's magnificent, marvelous, mad Madam Mim, but I can't remember if there's another adjective thrown in there.
But in any event,
Yeah.
we're here with his magnificence.
Oh gosh. We're gonna be bashing, I'm gonna be bashing elites in this time. I don't know if we should start by calling me magnificent.
That's the true nobility. True nobility, not the ersatz ability of institution. What we're going to discuss today are the critiques, or if you want to assume a less initially minatory term, the treatments of technology in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm never quite certain what the optimal pronunciation is. Should have brought a ring, but I don't have one. So,
I do. I've got
so it's the whole thing about the ring, and but it's not just about the ring, and it's not just about the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, because his work extends beyond that. Um, and I'm not deeply familiar with a lot of the other stuff, but I was actually thinking about that as I was sitting down, like in terms of the broader mythology that he channels, if you will. The stories that he tells as to the origins of the world, the Similarian and so forth. But and we might bring some people to bear along the lines, probably most notably Jacques Ellul, but there's all kinds of characters in the mix. But we can just start with Tolkien, and I know you're ready to, write out and meet the enemy, right?
I am, yeah, exactly.
How to how does one
There may
meet
come a
that
day when the strength of men may fail, Tom, but it is not this day. Um, yeah, so you mentioned last time that I wrote a book. I have it here, and this cover is gonna come back
Yes.
into play, but it's certainly heavily influenced by Lord of the Rings, as you can tell. And it's not really proper to call it a parody. It's maybe a subset of it, but yeah, I think influence is a good word to describe it. But I loved reading Tolkien growing up. I reread everything before I wrote Mordor, California, just to have as much of that world back in my frame of mind as possible for funny references and to deepen themes and things like that. But the as you said, the world of Tolkien is vast, and it is easy to sort of let a lot of the specifics of his broader mythology slip or fall into disrepair. And so I feel like I know a lot about the world. I did obviously some more research in preparation for this too, but there are certainly always some people who sort of devote themselves singularly to the world of Tolkien, and I admire people like Stephen Colbert, for instance, who just have a singular focus on it. But hopefully I can share as much of what I have taken from not just the Lord of the Rings, but Silmarillion and even interviews with Tolkien about this topic of technology, because I do think it's central to the themes of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And so I sort of have a little bit of an outline here that I think will provide maybe some touchstones for us, Tom, to kind of constantly go back to and flesh out or build off of at each point. And so I wanted to start with two very succinct quotes from the books, one about Sauron and one about hobbits. And then I want to immediately introduce, I know you mentioned Ellul, but I want to immediately introduce Illich's concept of the convivial tool, because I want you to see how it sort of maps on to these descriptions of Sauron and the hobbits, and then we'll go from there. I want to then maybe follow that up by looking more deeply at Sauron and the hobbits. But so Tolkien says of Sauron, actually it's Treebeard who says this. He says, Sauron has a mind of metal and wheels. He no longer cares for growing things. And then of hobbits, Tolkien writes, they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. I don't know if you'll find a more sort of succinct contrast of what Illich then says about how scientific discoveries can be used in two sort of divergent ways. But I will read what he says, and hopefully we can talk about how at least these initial quotes are almost straight in line with these descriptions. But Illich says basically, look, technology or scientific discovery can be used to specialize functions, institutionalize values, centralize power, to make people accessories of bureaucracies and machines. That's one way, right? That tech can be used. The other way is to enlarge the range of each person's competence, control, and initiative to promote autonomous and creative intercourse among persons and between people and their environments. And it's sort of, I think it would be my thesis. I was telling you before that doing all this made me want to write a book on this topic. It would be my thesis, of course, that Tolkien writes first. Obviously Tolkien's writing this in the wake of the Great War, and no doubt that influenced his view on technology. I don't know if you've seen, Tom, have you seen that movie about, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like Becoming Tolkien or something, but it's about his development as a writer and his experiences in the war. Have you seen that one?
No, I can't say that I have.
Yeah, I haven't either, but I sort of want to, just to see how it bears on these things. But and Illich never makes any reference to Tolkien, but I see how Sauron, the forces of Sauron and Saruman represent that first description of Illich: centralized power, specialized functions. These armies, these huge mechanistic armies and war machines. And
antagonism toward the natural world.
Exactly, yeah, 100%. And you see then that the hobbits sort of represent the exact opposite, and they are in Tolkien's legendary, I think, the apotheosis of that view, of that dedication to not just a healthy ecology in relationship to their local environment, but to a life dedicated to sort of enjoying good company, each other, and their beautiful shire that they love, And so that's sort of my central thesis. And then what I thought, Tom, would be interesting to do then is to explore the people who sort of take oppositional stances to this, which come from all kinds of directions, right? They come directly from fascists, of course, but also from like liberals, and from maybe what we talked about the other day, more authoritarian leftists, who either I don't think understand maybe fully the implications of technology and our relationship with technology and shaping our lives for better or for worse, or who do understand it and sort of actively want to use it to develop and maintain their own power over us, right?
Well, there's lots of, as that last thing brings to mind something I watched just yesterday, and sometimes I watch these things because we want to know the tune that the devil is playing. And there's a speech by this guy, Harari, Yuval Harari, who is sort of this mouthpiece, this organ, box of the establishment. He's painted as some kind of intellectual. I cherry to give him the dignity of such a sobriquet. But he was giving a talk counseling on the dangers of AI. And his analysis of AI while counseling its potential hazards itself was dubious, but it was all sort of leading up to a point where he's like, well, now that we see how dangerous this technology is, what's patent is that we need to regulate this technology and we need to prevent it from being released unduly into the public domain. And it's like right there it is. All right. Now, Harari, in many ways, exemplifies the figure of your NPR liberal who may be willing to concede or even embrace aspects of more radical critiques, but is then, for whatever reason, incapable of taking the next step and realizing a more dramatic break must be attained. And the way this is incarnated in Harari's perspective is in the insistence that they retain control. The establishment, the hegemon retains control of this dangerous technology. And there's like a fundamental distrust of other people, which is then articulated through this insistence on frankly, a grossly naive approach to the matter at hand in any event. Um, that's what you mean when you talk about liberals and I mean, or people who identify as creatures of the left, and there's a spectrum, and then there's those who are not really wanting to go all the way. They don't want to. So I don't want to just be discussing this the entire time. I think we need to fold this back into the world, the sketch of Tolkien, and we can maybe find some literary or character touch points within his narratives that sort of reflect that kind of character, because this kind of character, this beneficent, there's a kind of like a beneficent oppressor. Okay. Or the assistants and handmaidens to the assistant oppressors, right? I mean, you could almost look at uh, Saruman, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sort of, with his, in some ways, he is, saying, well, we got to work with this stuff. So there's the alliance with Sauron.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I don't know if he's the best
he has his
example.
own, and Saruman has his own subalterns, right? He has Grima Wormtongue and things. The books and the movies diverge on what happens to them, but things don't end well for them, right?
In either case, so.
Yeah. What reminded me, I think so. I think what you were describing too is sort of what Bookchin would deride as the managerial radical, whom he scathes.
That's a great term.
Yeah. Oh man, he really I'd have to go back and look at some of the specific language that he uses. But yeah, I think if you were looking for an analog in Lord of the Rings, maybe not a single person, but maybe there's an instance where Theoden, has been awakened from his, sort of the coma that he's been in from Saruman, that Saruman and Grima Wormtongue are responsible for, and he finds his kingdom in ruins, and he doesn't want to commit Rohan to battle, because he wants to preserve his people. And Aragorn says something to the effect of like, the battle is here. There's no delaying it. There's no escape from it. You sort of have to confront it. And so if you're looking for an analog in the books, I think that's the most apt.
Yeah, no, I think so.
Yeah.
And then there's also Boromir, but that's a little different, right? Because what he wants to do is there's the temptation of technology.
Mm-hmm.
He's seduced by the notion of the ring,
Yeah.
right? And and the left is seduced by the promise of technology. And here we're not just like the weak,
Yeah.
degenerate Democratic Party. This goes all the way back to aspects of Marxism, where the belief is that as hideous as capitalism is, it's given us these new resources whereby to address the privations of the world. We can end hunger and cure disease and extend life and all these, obviously positive things, but that doesn't actually translate into a better life. But the seduction of the technological is 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 is, is significant. At the moment, it's difficult to exaggerate. What might be useful then would be to try and explicate the relationship between the technological and the question of power, right? Because some people might argue that by focusing unduly on the technological, you're allowing yourself to be subsumed in a sort of mystification which obscures the structure of power. I don't think that's what's happening. I think there's an intimate connection between those terms. But what do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's not just power. I think it's also the ways in which, or the way in which a vision of human nature connects to a depiction of the good life. So I think it's both relationships to power, but then also that link between, human nature and the good life. Because I think power is often exercised or seized under a justification for addressing certain faults in human nature, right? And so I think what you were saying is that there's this distrust in people, right? And so I'm going to come back to the ring, because I think the different ways in which the ring functions as symbol connect what you're saying about power and technology. But I also want to get back to this idea of like human nature and the good life. And we're going to come back. I'm going to quote from Peter Thiel above, but people like Peter Thiel and Edmund Burke and others, they sort of accept Hobbes's vision of human nature, right, as essentially self-interested and brutish and yeah, I mean, just sort of devious and all kinds of negative things, right? And it was Hobbes's vision of human nature is conjured out of thin air, right? But these people use that vision as justification for treating people as a multitude that needs to be managed by elites, right? That's their sort of justification for holding power, right? And I think all of the thinkers that we're probably going to talk about today sort of outright reject that perspective, right? That's they see people as creative, competent beings capable of managing both themselves and their own lives and their communities, right? And so the way that because they have that view of human nature, an accurate view, I think historically and anthropologically, and just something that we can experience in our daily lives, because they have that view, I think that they're able to imagine a good life beyond one of sort of industrial and progressive consumption. They can imagine something separate from that, whereas other people can't. And they can also imagine different power dynamics, Tom, among people, right? And how those power dynamics can be, impacted by technology, right? They can imagine all of those things because they sort of start from a different point about how they view people, right? If you want, though, I found the quote from to take a quick break back to the managerial radical. I want to read it actually, because now that I read it, I'm amazed at how much it links in with we're gonna come to all these ideas. It even mentions the word technique. When we get to Ellul, it will make a lot of sense. But so Bookchin says, the era of the managerial radical has pushed radicalism itself into the shadows of history. What we encounter today is the universal bureaucratization and technocratization of radicalism as such, not merely in the triumph of organizational bureaucracies and centralized leaderships, but in the very outlook, vision, and ideas of its most articulate acolytes. The managerial radical is the practitioner of organizational technique, of efficient manipulation, of mass mobilization as goals in themselves. Technique has become the substitute for social idealism. And I think when we get talking about Ellul, you will see, we'll obviously going to interrogate that idea of technique way more. But you
have to believe that Bookchin is directly invoking Ellul there,
I
because
think
that
so too.
language is
It's
explicitly out of the technological society.
Yeah, I think so too. It has to be informed by that for sure. But I thought it was a good point there to raise, just because it tied in with what we were talking about before, and I think it sort of immediately raises that that specter of technique, which we're gonna, I hope.
So this issue of bureaucracy, I have to say, while vital, isn't something that I think gets much direct treatment in Tolkien. I mean, there are some allusions to it, normally through the lens of court politics that come up in some of the kingdoms, right? But that's an issue which I think is maybe actually, I think there's some stuff in Lewis, which is C.S. Lewis, which might be more apropos, or that specific aspect of the dynamic with which we're wrestling. But to stay on human nature for a moment and come back to Tolkien, there is this tension in Tolkien because, the hobbits are kind of the ideal because of their talking about the good life, and they're situated within this bucolic context, and in many ways, they're echoing the conviviality which is celebrated by Evan Illich, where insofar as you have tools, and it's interesting that Illich will always use the word tool. He never uses the word technology. And even when he's talking about tech, he still persists in the use of the word tool. He does that. It's kind of a Illichian thing. He very deliberately invokes words that aren't circulating in the common discourse to try and jar us out of our ordinary understanding of whatever the phenomenon at hand is, right?
But I think his category of tools sort of subsumes tech and institutions.
Very broad.
Yeah, it encompasses all those things. Yeah.
But the thing is, the ideal of the Hobbit at times, to me, does seem just a bit romantic, I must confess, right? There's we might say that they represent an aspect of human being which merits celebration, but one can also then see the other races, as it were, of Middle Earth and ask, well, what is Tolkien addressing here, right? So they're the, 9 rings go to the men, right?
Yes.
And 5 to the dwarves and 3 to the elves. But there's 1 ring to bind them all. Oh, okay. So we can ask, what do the elves, what do the dwarves, and what do men respectively represent?
Mhm.
And of course, we can also look at the characters of the character of Aragorn, who has an acute awareness of human limitation and susceptibility to the allure of power. Even within his own being, he struggles with that. Um, so I don't know what your thoughts are on that stuff.
Yeah, so I think Illich has a thought on it, Tom. And I think Illich would say that the reason that you might sort of see the hobbits as romantical, is that he says our vision of the feasible is so restricted by industrial expectations that any alternative to past production sounds like a return to past oppression or like utopian design for noble savages. And I picked out that quote. Um, I picked out that quote because it mentions the noble savages, because it mentions utopia. And I was going to then follow that up with some ideas about the Amish. And when we talk about law, especially because he even uses the word noble savage, to talk about a little bit about what the language is, what type of language is used by judges making determinations about Native Americans in terms of water law and land use. But that's something that I think will come up later. But what I wanted to say is that I understand that idea, but I don't ever want to sort of reject outright the possibility of that type of life. And they're fictional characters, so like they're different from the Amish and from Native Americans. Like I don't want to necessarily, conflate them so much that we lose sight of the fact that,
They're
I think
also very English.
that's true. Yeah. Oh yeah, 100%. So there's lots of differences there, and especially because, and one of the reasons I definitely don't want to do that is that a lot of the sort of racist discourse that's and venom that's directed at Native Americans always treats them as if they are creatures of myth themselves, enshrined in you know um a mythical past, and not as creative, competent beings who made conscious choices to live certain ways. You know what I mean? So I might see in the hobbits then sympathetic figures who sort of represent, in a fictional sense, these real communities who are, often dismissed as something, relics of a romantic past, and not as real models for how we could consciously invert or reorder our lives to maximize our joy, and harmonize with our ecologies. So maybe a slight pushback from me, but I understand the critique there.
Well, I just think that there's a dynamic that you have to put it all together. And as you're talking, I'm also thinking about how the hobbits themselves, some of them are changed by
Yeah.
the rings and their experiences and so forth, right?
Right. Yeah. So
So,
that's an important thing, Tom, that I was going to pick up there, because you sort of asked about the differences, right, between
right.
men and dwarves and elves. And so the elves are the hardest one to really, I think, grasp, but they're the hardest to understand anyway. But the men desire power. The dwarfs are greedy. And maybe this is a good moment to sort of come back to the ring really quickly before I get into the elves and the hobbits, right? So the ring symbolizes many things. I think the two most obvious are concentrated power, right? It's a kind of fasces, right? It's you know yeah, it's just concentrated power. Tolkien said that it's a meditation on placing power in external objects. And again, external objects like what? Like what Illich would say, tools, institutions, bureaucracies, right? So it's important to read it as that. And maybe I'll bring in another Bookchin quote really quickly, where he says that, the danger in externalizing and professionalizing power, and you could substitute for power tools, institutions, bureaucracies, is that you sort of embolden and empower, I guess, a privileged class at the expense of people, right? Expense of everybody. Yeah, and so you'll ultimately end up reproducing, he says, systems of subordination around a body of elites when you externalize power. So to hear Tolkien say explicitly that it's a meditation on placing power in external objects, right, instead of in people and in communities, I think that's important to read it that way. Obviously, it's also, I think the other obvious way to read the ring is symbolic of material greed. It causes quote unquote gold sickness among the dwarves, right? So it's easy to see, I think, how what those rings meant for both men and for dwarves. The elves are, I think, far more complicated. They're always sort of worried about just sort of the loss of elven culture. Always looming over them is just sort of the idea that their time in the earth is just over, that the clock is just ticking down. They're interesting too, because Sauron convinces Celebrimbor, the elven smith, the elven craftsman, to forge the rings. And this is you see this chronicled in the Rings of Power, the new show on Amazon. But the idea is that it will sort of help elves preserve their time in Middle Earth. So it's a little bit different there. I think maybe doesn't fit quite as neatly into our categories. But I think that absent then those two sort of obvious ways in which the ring can be that functions as a symbol, I think the last one is symbolic of technology. In that they become tools of domination and control, right? Sauron says, no, this is going to help you. This is going to help you. He says to the elves, this will help you deal with and cope with the various threats that your community faces that threaten your existence. But in fact, they become tools of domination and control, which I think is a broader narrative about technology that obviously Tolkien wants to present, right? That what's these things that seem on their surface to be aids have an ulterior purpose, a nefarious and destructive ulterior purpose that is maybe not quite so obvious. And then one last thing then I'll say, Tom, is like, how do the hobbits fit in here? There was a quote that I used the other day when we were talking about education, and it came from Nietzsche, of all people, who said, that the link between intelligence and property becomes a sort of ethical demand. And I think the reason that the hobbits become capable or are depicted as capable of managing the ring, at least over short periods. Well, Bilbo has it for a very long time. But it does have impacts on everyone. That's true. Even on people like Smeagol and on Bilbo and Frodo as well. Really destructive impacts on them. But it's that their vision of the good life, Tom, has not. It is that ethical demand, that link between, let's say intelligence, let's say potential and power, right? Like it's not part of their culture. Whereas when you look at the men and the dwarves, there's that ethical demand that when they envision the power that the ring will bring, that demand takes over, right? It becomes impossible to prevent. It becomes impossible to deal with for them, right? But because the hobbits have a different vision of the good life, they're better able to deal with the temptations of the ring. Now, some people will say they're maybe the most interesting moment of the ring tempting a hobbit is actually when Samwise Gamgee is a ring bearer for a very small amount of time. When after Frodo's been stabbed by Shelob, Sam thinks that Frodo's been killed, and so he takes the ring and thinks that he's going to have to complete the quest on his own. And when he's bearing the ring tempts him, and it gives him visions. And most people focus on the second part of the vision. The second part of the vision is just he imagines all of Mordor turned into a beautiful garden, which is I think it is very illuminating to see, like that's the most the ring could do to a hobbit, is to imagine, a dark, completely arid and lifeless area restored to a massive garden. But there is another component to it, and that is that Samwise imagines himself sort of riding a big horse and carrying a flaming sword and being the one who's sort of individually responsible for the restoration of Mordor into this sort of new Eden. And that's the danger, right? Because we want to really truly form a garden, you need a collective effort. You need a community effort to form that, right? So it does work against Sam, but at the same time, what it's tempting him with is very different from what maybe men or dwarves or whomever might be tempted by, So that's my take, I think, on how hobbits differ from everybody in their relationship to the ring.
I think there's something else going on, or at least, and I'm really thinking about is the changes that occurred to Bilbo. You see it in Frodo too, right? But Bilbo no longer enjoys the Shire. Right after his adventures, he comes back, the affair with the dragon and all that, right? And he's there, he gets along or whatever, but he really is ready to get the heck out of there. Okay. Now in the very beginning, he doesn't want any part of leaving the Shire,
Yeah.
Gandalf has to give him the nudge, right? Okay. But his was hardly involved. But this transformation, and I think maybe I'm guilty of projecting a little bit of my awareness of the sort of Christian backdrop, right? Okay, is sort of like there's a loss of innocence. And I guess the question I ask is this loss of innocence that you see in Bilbo and see in Frodo, you don't really see it in Sam. I mean, he's tempted, but it's fleeting. But is this a kind of ontological transformation, which then is analogous to what transpires in the story of the Garden of Eden, where you participate in the knowledge of the tree of good and evil? Does this affect an essential transformation in one's being?
It may be that.
And then, I mean, that connects to the technological directly.
Yeah.
Because that's what the knowledge of the tree of good and evil is, right? Is in this desire for mastery.
Yeah. I'll have to go back and look at the books more closely to see how it describes their motivation for leaving. the Shire, to go with the elves. I know I mean, from what I can recall, I mean, I think you could read it this way too, in that, well, I think you could read it maybe both ways, right? That because of what he's experienced and learned, because of what he knows of evil, now Frodo feels like he can't maybe enjoy the Shire in the way that he previously could as an innocent. But I think you could also say that, I'm always interested in this reading too, where and maybe this is, something I'm picking up maybe more from Star Wars than anything else, but especially the new show Andor, where the person who commits themselves to a revolutionary act ultimately feels or believes that they have to sort of do something or become something that would no longer belong in the world that is created or preserved by that revolutionary act, right? That there's some aspect of the evil that they wish to destroy that they must sort of embody in order to accomplish that and create. I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit different. I mean, obviously they're different contexts, but I think you could maybe read it a little bit that way too with Frodo. But yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about as much. Is the fact that Frodo can only stay in the Shire when he returns for a few years before he has to he feels he has to leave, whereas Samwise lives there happily and married with children, and sort of returns to his former life very easily. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I'll have to do some more reading on that particular.
I mean, we also have to guard against an excessively allegorical relationship to the text here, right? It's not like every character is a symbol that maps in a neat way onto this or that other kind of thing. And that you have to also allow for these indeterminacies, because that's really the genius of Tolkien as opposed to Lewis. With the Chronicles of Narnia, it's pretty much a one-to-one allegory. All right. And to me, that makes it just a less compelling kind of vision than you find with Middle Earth, where
I agree.
there are points of correspondence and he's addressing themes, but you can't reduce it to a mere allegory.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, obviously I think it's certainly invested with pretty conspicuous and powerful symbolism, but I agree with that. And of course, that's what we're trying to do here, is to sort of surface a lot of those ideas. But I think the other reason why I like Lord of the, Tolkien or Middle Earth better than C.S. Lewis, and why I think most people do, is it's also far less moralistic, right? The children are always get in trouble for liking sweets or for wearing makeup or something, right? Like those are like major plot points that end up, putting the group into trouble or demoting somebody in a certain estimation. And Middle Earth, it's the opposite. The hobbits are, Gandalf has such an adoration of the hobbits because of their pipe weed and their love of beer and
this is also a very Illichian point, by the way.
Yeah.
Because what Illich talks about, and this is sort of more later Illich, right? Though it's there in Tools for Conviviality, he calls for a new ascesis, a new kind of asceticism, where I'm sorry I kind of interrupted you there, but let's see if I actually have it here. Yes. It's in this essay, Brave New Biography, Healthcare from Womb to Tomb, but toward the end of it, he's decrying the excessively technical world and the preoccupation with efficiency and all that kind of thing. And oh, here we go. I'll read it. It's a little bit lengthy, but renunciation can free one. That's not the best ways to start. Okay. Well, I'll just start there anyway, right? Because then it'll all make sense by the time I finish the passage.
Okay.
Renunciation can free one from the powerlessness which robs me of my awareness of my sense, but renunciation is not a familiar concept today. We no longer have a word for courageous, disciplined, self-critical renunciation accomplished in community, but that is what I'm talking about. I will call it ascesis. I would have preferred another word for ascesis or asceticism. Today brings to mind Flaubert and St. Anthony in the desert, turning away from wine, women, and fragrance. But the renunciation of which I speak has very little to do with this. The epoch in which we live is abstract and disembodied. The certainties on which it rests are largely senseless. And their worldwide acceptance gives them a semblance of independence from history and culture. What I want to go, well, he goes on from there, but then he gets a little bit technical. But
No,
the main point,
I get what you're saying here, and he says something similar in the Convivial Tool where he's trying to basically define convivial and contrast it with austerity, but he's also like digging into the definitions of each and sort of saying that
he tries to bring about this notion of austerity. He never really quite lands on the best word, but the point is that you got to renounce the temptation of progress. The progress being defined as that which is accomplished through industrial tools, industrial school tools, industrially scaled tools. And the problem with industrial scaled tools is that they dominate their users.
Yeah.
Right? That's the one difference between a convivial tool, which is empowering and enhances your autonomy. You use the tool as opposed to the tool using you. So the automobile is the interesting sort of like middle case, because at first blush, you think the automobile enhances your autonomy. But what it actually does is bring you in a way into a kind of radical dependency, because then you have to depend on the roads and the system of petrochemical production and everything else that goes into the manufacture and the utility of the car.
Yeah.
So it actually compromises your autonomy while creating an illusion of it.
Yeah.
Right.
So interesting fact. When Tolkien saw what happened to his beloved Oxford when they paved roads to allow the passage of cars, he sold his car and rode a bike, which is exactly what Illich would suggest doing, right?
An incredibly Illichian act. Yeah,
it is 100%. And I think you nail it. I think the other thing Illich would say about cars is that they promise moving at a high speed, but that the higher the speed of the vehicle, he says, the slower you actually go. Like the more time you actually spend from A to B, right? Like that you end up spending more time in traffic or whatever it might be, right? That it's an illusion of speed. One thing I will say, going back to sort of the initial idea, is that I think in working through all those definitions, I think you're right that Illich never quite sort of completely expresses what he wants to say here. But I think what he's trying to do is sort of to like rescue an actual fruitful form of hedonism. And he tries to couch it in the language of limit, which seems much more austere, maybe, right? Or it seems much more restrictive. but I think he's trying to rescue a kind of fruitful hedonism from the idea of like from the aspect of sort of consumption, which I think he sees as sort of come to dominate how we view, taking pleasure from various things in the world, right? So that's my reading of all that talk of what you called ascesis, and then also his working through of convivial and austere in the first part of Tools for Conviviality.
Well, the other thing, I mean, I think with Illich, he's really concerned with embodiment and fleshment, the flesh, the sensuousness of our world, and
Yep.
having a human experience through those avenues. Like real relationship arises out of that incarnate kind of encounter. And where I feel he's most stressed about the contemporary impasse is the degree of abstraction and how our culture glorifies abstraction and is, enthralled by it. And this is really just leading to an alienation, like a structural alienation, which is almost impossible to overstate. I think that's somewhat different than what Tolkien is discussing, though obviously they're related, right? But the hobbits retain this sensuous connection to the world. They're not blurred by the temptations of mathematizing the universe and then using that mathematization to forge the rings, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us back to the elves, who seem to have this technical mastery. Excuse me. But for some reason, they're not as detained by it. Why do you think that is, right? Like, and even actually all the races have some kind of technical mastery. The dwarves have their capacities to forge mithril and so forth, right?
Elven smiths and dwarf and the dwarves are known for their metalwork and stuff. But yeah, I mean, they're always hailed as sort of really skillful. But remember, in that quote, in the quote that I presented with the hobbits, Tolkien says they were skillful with tools too. Not quite necessarily in the same way maybe that elves and dwarves are, but I think that's the point, right? That there's
they didn't like anything more complicated than a water wheel,
right?
As it were.
They choose tools that are conducive for the lifestyle that they want. And that's a big thing with Illich, and maybe choice is an interesting word to use, right? But this idea that instead of having our lives predetermined by technology that we inherit and do not understand and cannot control, that the whole concept of the convivial tool is sort of a reorienting of our relationship to it, to where we think through, select tools that will help us accomplish the things we want to in our lives without sort of relinquishing control to them. Also like enabling healthful relationships with other people and with the environment, right? But it is a an inversion of that that idea of control, that the tools don't control us, that we control them. and for specific purposes, you know. And
Yeah.
I think that's where the Amish are interesting, because I can't remember if Illich mentions them explicitly in Tools for Conviviality, but I'd been reading about the Amish in other places, and they're usually othered and demeaned as backwards, or sort of depicted as silly, and they have a whole other complement, a whole other set of beliefs, religious beliefs and things like that, that I'm not really fluent in, that I'm not really going to talk about it, but they do have a particular view of technology, and it's usually dismissed, epitomized as just a phobia, right, or anti-technology, but that's not what it is. They ask a question: will it support the fabric of our community? And if it will, then they will embrace it, and if not, they will not. And one thing that I thought was really interesting, I mean, the obvious one is the barn raising, right? Like, it's essential for community building. It's we think of usually, and I'm gonna tie this back in here in a second with some more information on hobbits, and the way that they think about buildings, right, or housing, right? But that's sort of the obvious one. I think that the one that people may not know about is that Amish people they will not institutionalize insurance, because it depersonalizes and it minimizes their personal commitments to each other, right? The community is the insurance pool. And I think that someone might say, well, that's what GoFundMe is. And I think that you'd be so maybe enthralled by that, by the technology involved in GoFundMe, that you miss fundamental differences between how the Amish conceive of ensuring the health and security of their community members, and the idea of a completely, even more depersonalized, just this, these two things are not the same, right?
No, I mean, I was trying to find a passage but I can't find it directly. I did have my little ancient copy of Tools for Conviviality.
I have a little bit more,
But it was where it talks about, take it or leave it. Like, you can take or leave a tool.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about GoFundMe is, and this is one of those middle cases, like, there actually are some interesting remarks in Tools for Conviviality about how it's not just a question of scale. So, for instance, he characterizes the telephone system as convivial. And actually, it might be when he talks about the phone system that he talks about this capacity to leave or take it. I don't want to just be looking for it.
Well, just to get to maybe give some surface comments on GoFundMe, like, it's, even from the title of it, it has these connotations of like startups, and I don't know if that's its primary or its initial purpose. I only know how it's sort of used to sort of get people funds who can't afford funerals because of some tragedy, or who've suffered some other kind of tragedy and need money for medical care or whatever. Like, it sort of seeks to fill the gaps that are heavily marketized security or social networks just can't, that they can't provide. But that's the idea, though, is that it bears this aspect of the market, right? It is a tool, it is a market-based tool, right? Like, it's going to be, it is always going to be insufficient for a purpose like this, which is to extend not false generosity, but to extend care and concern to honor the bonds of, or I don't want to say pacts, I don't want to make it seem contractual, but to honor a sense of like mutual self-care, or the ways in which, you know, yeah, I mean, I think that there's, I
It's a
just think that there's
potential
something,
avenue for mutual aid, maybe.
yeah, there's just something.
But I don't think you have to remunerate. You don't have to repay the people who give you stuff, right? The way it works is
No,
that,
not on GoFundMe. No.
right. So
Unless it's a scam, which lots of
right.
people use, come up with scenarios that they then get people to send funds to them, and then
That's true, but
yeah,
you can't use a corruption of a thing to legitimately criticize it.
yeah,
So those are sort of, but in principle, what I mean, the limitation is that you really don't have the basis for a deep relationship.
right,
There's that, and that has to do with the fact that it's connected with the internet as a medium of interaction. And so almost definitionally, it's you're interacting with people at a distance, which
yeah,
is not prima facie a problem, but you have, I think that the thing with which we need to wrestle, and it's a challenging issue even here, right? We're using this to speak at a kind of distance, right? But is there not an upper limit as to the depth of relationship which can be derived through interacting with this kind of medium? Uh, and here we run into the issue of our spatiality, or the spatial dimension of relationship. And are we being kind of hypnotized to underplaying the importance of spatial intimacy by something like the internet? By something, GoFundMe to me is constructive, potentially constructive as a point of departure, but it's not a point of conclusion. Now, where does that connect to the Amish in their insurance
well,
pools?
I
Well,
do
the
think it's an
difference is
illusion.
that,
It's an illusion of community, right? It's
right,
not a real dependable.
the dependencies are really fictive,
Yeah,
as opposed to in the Amish case, or not just the Amish case, but in the case of people who live in proximity to each other and who work together for their own food, and then it's real. There
yes,
are stakes.
exactly. And so I think you can be more, I think you can derive more positive feeling from a more of an increased certainty of reciprocal care and concern, right? And maybe it's not so much that I will be taken care of if something befalls me, but that I am significant in taking care of my community and what I can provide for other people, But yeah, I agree that it's fictive. It's an illusion of community, which is constantly offered in place of actual community, right? It's sort of all that like technocratic liberalism can provide, right? Like that's its limit, right? Is the newest
This, yeah,
yeah.
is where it really comes out. You should, if you haven't, I got the impression that you didn't happen to have read this one. You haven't read Medical Nemesis.
Well, I mean,
And right,
there's a lot of
the theme is,
critique of medicine in Tools for Conviviality, and even in other of Illich's works, but I have not read that book.
but what comes out in Medical Nemesis and in other stuff of his too, right, is that, and even in Tools for Conviviality, the institutional care displaces real care. And like GoFundMe displaces, or compromises
Yeah,
things, so,
these figures.
and this is a part of the creation of modern poverty, right? He calls modern poverty, or consequence of radical monopoly on the part of institutions and professions to not just provide needs, but to define our needs. And it's really inimical to actual relationship, because once the institution is providing the need, it's not even the people and the institutions who are providing the need. They are actually just acting as a sort of vicars of the institution, right? So there's a person who happens to be the doctor who's providing the care, but you're not in relationship with that person. You're in relationship with this abstract doctor,
Yeah.
and the person is just kind of standing in for the doctor, right? It's like really this like intensely now happily relationships arise anyway, but they arise despite and not because of the frame of the institution.
Yeah.
And it could be healthcare, it could be education, it could be transportation. It's this and this circles back to the issue of abstraction, I guess, right?
Mhm.
And there's where really what you have, and this is the note of contact between Illich and Ellul, who is in some ways just devastating, like almost too much for me sometimes. It's like calm down, Jacques. Okay, but Ellul's insight is into the monolithic the totalizing nature of the technological mentality. It's truly totalizing. There's nothing that will escape its logic. And it's not about the machine. The machine is an expression of the technological mentality. But the technological mentality is a mentality of domination. It's like, here's a problem and we're going to fix it. And that underlying disposition is utterly implacable and will destroy human civilization if we don't come to a reckon, and not that it will literally destroy human civilization, because it has no tolerance for openness. The desire of, when you reduce the world to a problem, the only solution is absolute order. And absolute order, to draw a tidy syllogism, is incapable of life.
Yeah. The that word order comes up in, I read a little bit of Ellul to prepare too for today. And I know at one point we're going to talk about, or hopefully we get to it today, I'm not sure if we will or not, but about the law. And Ellul talks about the when he talks about order, when I hear that, I think about what he says about the law. Let me see where it comes up. But he says,
well, I mean, the thing is that for Ellul, the law in principle is a medium of justice. But because justice is, I mean, I happen to have the passage here, right? And it's actually like a fantastic
law becomes a mere instrument of the state, and in the end, law disappears.
That's the end point. But the
He says,
beginning
what is needed is not a person with a sense of justice. Oh yeah, let me start here. Okay. Application of law no longer arises from popular adhesion to it, but from the complex of mechanisms which by means of artifice and reason adjust behavior to rule. It says what the law needs is not a person with a sense of justice, but a good technician, one who understands the principles of technique. He says it's better injustice than disorder to the current system, right? The current system would prefer injustice over disorder. But he says order signifies the same thing as efficiency. We talked a lot about efficiency in our first conversation, because order is the will of the state. Efficiency itself is order. Law thus becomes an activity without any end or meaning. It is efficiency for efficiency's sake. And I think Tom, Illich and Ellul, I think, view the law in completely I think they have I think they have opposite perceptions of the law. I think Illich sees the law as a possible route for political inversion to enable
Yeah.
a convivial society. I think Ellul here clearly is much more skeptical of that possibility. And I honestly think that I'm more in agreement with Ellul on this. As someone who I do have a law degree from UCLA, and it's one of the reasons I was hoping to talk about the law, because there's a lot of offshoots here that I think are really relevant to our conversation in the law. I think one of the ones that comes to my mind when we talk about order and efficiency, but also maybe more so just this idea of the good technician, is sort of the preoccupation that a lot of the conservative justices, not just on the Supreme Court, but elsewhere, have with textualism, which is almost, I think, Tom, the perfect example of technique, right? It claims to be this objective, this neutral, scientific interpretive modality, right? A way of sort of avoiding all possible aspects of bias, right? In a way of, and it purports to create democratic accountability, but it doesn't really purport to lead to just outcomes, but more so just to lead to ones that correspond with sort of the initial intent of the law, right? So you see that it's already oriented in a very different way in terms of what its goals are, right? But there's
That's very Burkean. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Yeah, like it's just following the tradition, right? Regardless of where it leads you, just sort of, it's like a blind faith in the tradition as such. But there's a really smart UCLA professor named Carrie Franklin who looks at textualism and sort of really deconstructs it. And she says that, she just sort of exposes it for what it is, right? And says, like, there are all sorts of extra textual concerns, and there are all sorts of ways in which textualism just falls apart. Like there's textual gerrymandering, what words you choose to interpret. What dictionary do you choose to use, or do you choose to use a corpus linguistics? It's impacted by whether or not you consider the word or phrase to be ambiguous, which one could argue that all words and phrases are ambiguous, especially if you understand linguistics and how everything arises from a network of reference anyway, right? But of course, just as the law is really bad at anthropology, it's also really bad at linguistics. And all of this is to say is that what's happening is that there is a raw exercise of political power that's occurring, and it's being masked by technique and by the gesture at some kind of pure distillation of technique, and so, yeah, that was one example I really wanted to talk about when it came to, I think, the differences between Illich and Ellul when it comes to the law, and then more specifically with sort of maybe presenting an example of maybe what Ellul means by technique in a context maybe other than something we might associate with like industrial machinery or whatever, right? Because it's broadly applied, right? Technique.
So I wanted to read one more section.
Yeah.
And then we'll connect it to textualism and whatnot. But
yeah,
this is earlier in when he begins talking about the law. The function of justice provokes an unending major debate between the claims of justice and those of judicial technique. Judicial technique is in every way much less self-confident than the other techniques because it is impossible to transform the notion of justice into technical elements. Despite what philosophers may say, justice is not a thing which can be grasped or fixed. If one pursues genuine justice and not some automatism or egalitarianism, one never knows where one will end. A law created as a function of justice has something unpredictable in it, which embarrasses the jurist. Moreover, justice is not in the service of the state. It even claims the right to judge the state. Law, created as a function of justice, eludes the state, which can neither create nor modify it. The state, of course, sanctions this situation only to the degree that it has little power or has not yet become fully self-conscious, or to the degree that its jurists are not exclusively technical rationalists and subordinated to efficient results. Under these conditions, technique assumes the role of a handmaiden, modestly resigned to the fact that she does not automatically get what she desires. So he actually opens the section with a relatively positive characterization of the law, but then proceeds to describe how it's utterly displaced by technical rationality. But what's also actually kind of fantastic about that phrase is it's an anarchist theory of law, where you see the state cannot tolerate the law. The state is the primordial crime.
Right. Or that the state reconstitutes law as a sort of, as a kind of self-defense, right? Like it reformulates it, and the law becomes that which preserves the state, I agree with both of those.
But it was important, I think, and then he concludes the section talking about how a sense of justice is one of the most fundamental aspects of human beings. He makes that claim that we have a sense of what is just. And it's also fundamental that what is just cannot be specified.
Yeah.
So there is an incommensurability
Yeah.
between the terms of justice and order that I think is absolutely crucial.
Well, and I think
now, we can bring that back to textualism. Sorry, I didn't want you to
Yeah.
think that I had lost that thread, right?
Yeah.
There's the other thing about textualism is that it's ironically incredibly ahistorical. It's incredibly deconstructionist. And these are motifs of approach which are sometimes connected with the postmodernity that conservatives lament, but they are being incredibly postmodern in their textualism. But anyway, that's just an aside.
Yeah. Well, I was going to bring it back. I think it was a good, because I wanted to sort of have a really let's say thorough examination of sort of indigenous thought on this matter, because I think, like I said, that they're often one of the critiques of the main critiques of people who or let's say counter critiques of people who suggest that technology can have all these sort of dangerous impacts on human freedom is that, you just want to return us to sort of a primitivistic state, right? And there's always this sort of really harsh negative connotation associated with the past. And I want to talk about that in a second, but what I want to say first is that, the maybe traditional Western legal system, the British system and the American systems, is not the only form that the law has taken, right? Like there are tribal courts that operate very differently, that rather than seeking sort of punitive measures or focusing exclusively on punitive measures, are built around models of restorative justice. They operate very differently, and they're obviously much more varied too. Across
in
tribes.
the Islamic world, there's another approach as well, right? Which sometimes we get this in sort of like hackneyed concept of like Sharia law. Yes, there are like it's just a grossly misunderstands how it actually operates. And I,
Well, of course,
but,
yeah. We're,
but where there's a communal context in which these decisions are made. And I don't want to romanticize certain things that happen. Some of them are actually dreadful. But what happens is the court in these cases is not technicized.
yeah,
That's the
exactly.
important thing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and that's I think and it varies too. There are certain tribal courts that maybe more closely resemble uh just sort of your average, municipal court or whatever it might be. But then there are others that differ far more. And I'm not necessarily, I have some familiarity with them, but obviously
What is the relationship between tribal law and federal law and state law? What are the relationship amongst those two?
that's a complicated question, Tom. The
Because
thing
they're
is,
kind of like a quasi-autonomous nation. Like they're not actually, I
well,
mean,
they
the
would,
American, or how is that cashed out?
well, tribes would say that they're sovereign, and
Right.
they defend vehemently that sovereignty. But the way that federal Indian law works, of course, is that it's constantly sort of chipping away at that sovereignty, right? And so you can be tried because they're considered separate sovereigns. You could be tried for the same crime in tribal court and in federal court. But let's just say the jurisdictional question, Tom, which I don't know if you're necessarily asking that, but the jurisdictional question requires a flow chart that almost defies comprehension in terms of what, who's involved, tribal member, non-tribal member, where did it occur, tribal land or state land or federal property, like all those things come in.
Which offense was that being violated? Because there's
Exactly.
tribal law and then there's federal law and there's
Right.
state law.
And so
And then you
all
could
of
even
those,
violate tribal
yeah.
law,
And
which
so
is
all those things factor into um, who can be tried where, but what I'll say, and I don't think people will be quite so interested in all the specifics of that. And, I don't want my professors to know how much I've let slip. But what I would say is that in general, the unfortunate trend is that, states, especially states, but also the federal government is sort of constantly chipping away at tribal sovereignty with the law, et cetera. But I will say that there was a good decision today that preserved ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a positive outcome for tribes. But that's
Well, I
a
mean,
big that's a
what is,
major tangent.
that's a tangent.
Yeah, it's a major tangent, but we can talk about
Because, yeah. So, I mean, the thing that happens is you have like these insidious, like welfare is an insidious mechanism for empire.
yeah.
And I don't know the specific law in question here, right? But sometimes
It has welfare in it, but it doesn't mean it's not a form of welfare. It's just whether or not basically it's whether or not non-tribal members can sort of remove remove Indian children from their families and communities. And obviously the real tragedy of all of it is that it's obviously this external majority culture that has encircled and deliberately deprived and impoverished these tribal communities through every possible mechanism, and then uses the perverse logic of saying, well, these children shouldn't be allowed to grow up here because the standard of living is not adequate. That so it's a genocidal logic that's ongoing, and so at least it's not the end of the story, but
this was
it's a
sorry.
moment where at least it's an important moment where certain
So
aspects of that genocidal attack are held at bay, at least
it,
momentarily.
the big flat, well, there are a few flashpoints in between Ivan Illich and the Vatican. I mean, he was a Roman Catholic priest. He was never defrocked, right? but he ended his relationship, his formal relationship with the Vatican in the wake of a inquisitorial imbroglio, which is kind of interesting. But it had to do with a few different things. It had to do with certain things he said about contraception, certain things he said about nuclear power, and nuclear power is probably sort of what sealed the deal, because he believed that the Vatican should denounce nuclear weaponry unequivocally, which I think is absolutely the correct position. It is just the cowardice of Rome that they did not just say no. These things are just they're evil. That's it. Okay, and but where the everything escalated was, and this started in the
Side note, Tom, I can't even imagine the level of propaganda that we're going to get with Oppenheimer. You know about Oppenheimer, right? The movie.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah, I know that movie. Is it out yet, or it's about to come out?
I don't know. It's coming out soon, but
I am Shiva, destroyer of worlds. Okay.
Graeber has skewered The Dark Knight Rises in another article of his for basically just being fascist apologetics. I can't
That's a problem with Batman, but
yeah.
But in general,
he sees it as a backlash against Occupy Wall Street. He sees Dark Knight Rises as a
yes. Well, yeah. that's certainly there, right?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that's it's the same director, Dark Knight Rises and Oppenheimer, and if David Graeber were still alive, and I really wish that he were, but I can't even imagine what he'd be priming, what he would have to say, how he would savage that.
Yeah, again, of course, Oppenheimer renounced nuclear power and became part of the anti-nuclear movement. Of course, I think that's what they call day late, a dollar short.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the movie, don't know what its conclusions are, so I can't, but it seems like there's some aspect of, I mean, considering it's called Oppenheimer and it doesn't focus on anything else, it seems like there's going to be a certain level of hagiography associated with
I'm sure that there will be. I don't
think
but to draw the circle where Illich really got into trouble initially was he called it the war on subsistence, and he was highly critical of the church's involvement with so-called outreach to the third world. And you're bringing things to the third world, like help them, so-called green revolution, so-called literacy programs. And he saw these all as like Trojan horses that were going to destroy Western medicine, destroy these cultures, and which they did by and large, right? And that's the point of contact with tribal law, right? Where it's a cultural war, and not in the like tacky sense that is sometimes deployed when you're talking about Starbucks or French fries, right? This is, as you said, this is a genocidal project.
Yeah, no, it is, and this is okay. So good. I'm glad I get to finally get into this. This is a rich seam of material I want to talk about. But you're right. It's a deliberate attempt not just to eradicate a people, but to eradicate a way of life and a conception of life. And as long as we're talking about the law, I want to get into the law. I'm gonna recite to you a few passages from actual cases, actual federal Indian cases. And I want you to hear, the outright racism will be obvious, but I want you to hear too that there's a far more insidious process that's taking place here, right? So the most famous case in federal law is Johnson v. McIntosh, and Justice Marshall pins that case, and he says, I'm not going to enter into the controversy over whether agriculturalists have the right to expel hunters from the territory they possess. He says that, but of course, that's exactly what he's doing in that case, is justifying agriculture as sort of
Such a primal
as a superior
problem.
method of food production over hunting and fishing and foraging,
It's
right?
literally biblical.
Yeah.
Literally biblical conflict.
And
Because
so
that's the thing you can't enable. But anyway,
so
go
he
on.
did that's true. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. Whether it's because what is it? One gives a gift of horse flesh or cattle flesh, whatever it might be, and the other one gives what only plants, and God sort of scorns the gift of only vegetation. Is that how it works, Tom?
I can't remember the details, but as I recall, it stands in for a conflict over symbolically agriculture versus, you know, hunting and a more
Yeah,
nomadic existence.
right.
But I don't want to risk making an error in my.
Yeah, I agree. I know it.
But don't get back to the Marshall.
Yeah.
It's
So
not gonna
he calls the Indians fierce savages because their subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest, and he depicts the American landscape as a wilderness, precisely because it has not been subjected to European farming techniques or property divisions. Now this continues. So in tribal water law cases, even in a case that's very positive for tribes, Winters, which essentially says, basically offers a broad protection for tribal water rights, which of course has been chipped away through really astoundingly awful logic throughout the years. But even in this good case, the author of that case calls Indians nomadic and uncivilized people, and he contrasts hunting and fishing with with agriculture and the arts of civilization. And he says that it was the express policy, and this is true, it was the express policy of the US government to change the nomadic habits of the Indians in order to make them a pastoral and civilized people. This is what allotment was designed to do, right? To chop up their property, to make it so that they were individual property owners and could not exist as a collective unit, right?
Just know that the same thing happened in England with the Enclosure Acts, where the application of a grid-like system is there to undermine people's ways of living.
Right.
And it happened with the Irish, and it happened. Well, it's a very British kind of thing.
Anyway, yeah. Well, it continues. There are more cases in U.S. v. New Mexico. Basically, the court says, look, there's a white settler preference for this water, and says that tribes can't use water for aesthetic or wildlife preservation purposes, because the reason that those water rights were granted was for maintaining a timber supply and enhancing the settling of the West. And in Bighorn River system, the court says that, the lack, because wildlife, well, here, before I get into this case, what you should know is what happens in Bighorn River system is astounding too, because there are quote unquote canons of construction that they put in place to prevent the exact kind of thing that happens in Bighorn River system. The canons of construction say, and again, this is technique, Tom, that any legal language in a tribal, in a treaty or in any kind of arrangement or agreement with tribes has to be liberally construed. Cases, anything, right? It has to be interpreted in a way most favorable to tribes. But of course, they never do either of those. There's actually 3 canons of construction, but the thing is, they don't do these things, right? These things are in place and they ignore them. They ignore that technique, right? They say that in Bighorn River system, because there's a lack of explicit mention of wildlife and aesthetic preservation, that the Wind River tribe basically can't use water for those purposes, that they can only use it for purely agricultural purposes.
Doesn't that directly countermand the imperative of the original canon of construction?
It does. It runs. Yep. And
of course, the counterpoint would be that the question is what constitutes the good, right? There's always a space of indeterminacy which can be challenged, right, which is why the law.
Well, that's exactly.
Okay, but
so anyway, so
Nick, these sorts of things literally nauseate me. They evoke a sense of physical nausea.
Yeah, it pains me too on a visceral level. what I will say is I also recommend everyone read The Dawn of Everything, because, you know, and the thing about it is that tribes for the longest time have been, you know, they call, I think they call it what, courtroom anthropology, or they call it chamber anthropology. They call it something. They've for the longest time, tribes know what we unfortunately are always like learning for the first time, right, in our own ways. But they've known for the long time that all this stuff is built on just really bad anthropology, right? Hobbes, Locke, Pinker, etc., right, that continue this idea. But Graeber and Wingrove say in this, like, look, there's no evidence to support the assertion that human culture has been inevitably evolving from foraging, fishing, hunting towards agricultural ones, right? And you know that they also say too that they think that a lot of that bad anthropology that you get from Hobbes is a conservative backlash against indigenous critiques that existed at that moment, in some ways that predated it, right? That these indigenous critiques that looked at Western culture and were astonished at the greed, the lack of concern that people had for their fellow human beings. You know, that these early initial Native Americans who would come to Europe and who would see beggars on the streets were just astonished that any community would let its people fall into that kind of state. Like, it just was something so foreign to them, right? And I'm going to bring that back actually to in a second here to hobbits, because there's a moment at the end of Return of the King that's very similar to an account from The Dawn of Everything, where basically, like I just described, I think his name is Micmac, but a Native American comes and sees basically a beggar on the street and can't fathom that would happen. But, you know, what Graeber and Wingrove say is that, you know, Native Americans are either demonized or romanticized. They're resigned to history or to myth. And what he says is that, like, look, he doesn't just look exclusively at Native Americans, but he says is that you can look at all kinds of early human societies and see that, you know, these people weren't noble savages, to go back to the phrasing that Illich used, right? They weren't or noble or fierce savages, to use the language, right? Like the two sort of archetypes that people often use to deprecate tribes. He said, look, these were complex human societies that consciously and deliberately rejected systems of hierarchy and domination, and experimented with different social structures, power dynamics, food systems, right? And that you can look at them and you can see robust and long-term programs of social care. You can see them choosing foraging lifestyles because it provided them nutritional needs, but also allowed them substantial rest and enjoyment, right? That, and they say, Graeber and Wingrove even say that in terms of having access to everything everyone needs and wants to live a happy, comfortable life, foraging societies were richer than our modern proprietarian ones. That they were free from constant toil and pursuit of land and wealth. That they were unwilling to let any member fall into poverty, hunger, or misery. That they celebrated eccentricity and sexual liberation. That they were committed to mutual care and happiness, and even anti-bullying. You know, that they're basically these really robust and rich communities. And I think a lot of people, we've talked about this before, a lot of people would say, okay, so you want to return us to this quote unquote primitive lifestyle. And I think what Graeber and Wingrove are saying is that, like, number one, to argue that we've sort of been, evolving from, which hasn't been happening anyway, but to make the argument that we've been evolving from these kinds of foraging communities into quote unquote agricultural ones, is to sort of, add like a moral dimension, I think, to sort of like historical events, and to I don't know, to frame that distinction in terms of primitive life and civilized life, I think is to sort of fundamentally make an ethnocentric, mistake.
There's a well, there's a normative set of normative assertions, but then there's also just a set of positive errors, right? Like, I mean, positive in the sense that uh, that's not how it actually happened, right? You
Yeah.
want to talk, like, this backwardness of what you speak is a fabrication, a confabulation that arose perhaps because there is an inability on the part of settlers and colonists to, or colonizers rather, um, to actually see the sophistication of whatever the victim society was,
Yeah.
right? Um, so where it gets a little bit tricky is that I think it um,
I
you
want to
have
say
to
first,
accept a degree of normativity in assessing these kinds of things. So because
yeah,
by criticizing, I mean, imperialism, you're also assuming, and I assume unapologetically a normative stance, right? That this frame of imposition is fundamentally wrong. It's actually deeply uncivilized.
right.
So I'm not afraid of being normative, but you just have to be clear about what's going on. And what's going on in the traditional story is that you are being sold a bill of goods with respect to the realities of these cultures.
Right.
Now,
And
we also have to recognize that it wasn't all rainbows and
nope,
unicorns.
of course not.
But
Nope.
anyway,
And I don't necessarily.
I'm not saying you're doing that either. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, I don't believe that. Number one, I also don't. I also am not necessarily advocating for sort of an attempt to reconstruct the conditions of the past. Only to say that conditions of the actual history and the actual conditions of the past do inform us both about what is in the capacity of human nature, but also about what we might be able to accomplish in the future, right? In that it can maybe help us establish goals or motivate us to pursue, certain types of social formations, or make us more, I don't know, apt to believe in the possibility of significant transformation. But that I'm not necessarily advocating for a return to the past. Only
No, I'm sorry if it sounded like I was telling you.
no, not at all. No. But more so just an accurate reckoning of who we are and what we can be, right? But to I know I wanted to tie that story real quickly back to a contrast between hobbits and Sauron that I think is sort of really central, that I want to return to, especially if we're going to introduce some other things here before. I'm sure we
should try to wrap it up here relatively soon, just because of the force of temporal finitude.
Sure, of course. So there's a moment, like I said, that you don't see this in the films, but there's a moment at the end of Return of the King, the book, where all the hobbits return to the Shire, and it's called the Scouring of the Shire. And one thing I want to point out before I talk about this is that, I see a clear distinction between, technology and ecology in just the buildings in Lord of the Rings, right? So hobbits build their homes directly into the earth, right? Whereas if you contrast that with Saruman and Sauron, what do they build? They build huge towers that are almost look like they're trying to escape the earth. They're trying to get as far from the earth as is possible, right? And what Tolkien says of Orthanc, of Isengard, he says, it seemed a thing not made by the craft of men, but riven from the bones of the earth in the ancient torment of the hills. It's
this is very interesting architectural problematic where I'm almost going to be disposed to push back a little bit, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Sure.
But so anyway, so then what happens is that when the hobbits return to the Shire, the first thing they see is that alerts them to something that's wrong, is they see two dismal, dreary, two-story-like houses that was built in a manner that they describe as most un-Shire-like. So that's their first instance that like, oh wait, something's wrong, right? But then that sort of architectural change is then translated into a whole host of social changes. So they and ecological changes. So they see that trees have been felled, the water's fouled. But then what happens is the people who occupy this un-Shire-like building show them an utter lack of hospitality. So that it's a dark and rainy night. They show up and they expect to be invited in. And it doesn't happen. And that act is so antithetical to their culture that they struggle to even comprehend it. They're just sort of astounded. They just sit there and they're just sort of like, they can't even process it, you know?
Isn't it what's the green? Isn't it Saruman and little underling? There's
It's Saruman and Grima Wormtongue who are responsible for all of this. They've returned to the Shire in retribution for what happened to Isengard. And Saruman, disguised as Sharky, is responsible for all this. But what's also interesting, I think, too, Tom, is that all of these changes are also accompanied by a sudden deference to external authority by people who previously would have never shown that kind of deference, right? So there's a chief who has a bunch of quote unquote sheriffs. It's just like it looks like a misspelling of sheriff, but you get what's happening, right? That a whole police structure emerges, there's deference to authority. And whereas before hobbits were known for sharing comfort and abundance, that's all been gone. The spies, they don't want to speak and share their thoughts because of the spies. The sheriffs have hoarded the beer and the pipe weed, so there's no longer a sense of abundance. And it's so bad, Tom, that Frodo says this is Mordor. He says this is Mordor. We've now what happens, of course, is that the hobbits are able to expel. They're able to expel the Saruman disguised as Sharky and Grima Wormtongue, and to collectively restore and rebuild the Shire that they knew, right? But I thought it was interesting. All of those things, the lack of hospitality, the deference to external authority, they lose sort of a sense of their freedom of speech because they're worried about spies. The sharing, the generosity changes, right? And it's also all tied, or else maybe announced by an architectural transformation, architectural change.
Well, I mean, it's the section is one in the book of underrated significance, and I actually suspect that it is echoing changes that Tolkien probably saw from after the war, and the manner in which the war, the Great War, and then subsequently World War II, how they changed the character of life in this way. On the architectural score specifically, right? And here, I guess I just can't help but be a little Promethean, but I have like a sympathy for height that sometimes is, I have these notions that are, like in terms of town and country, there's like this romanticization of the country that circles through a lot of progressive narrative. And, there are people like Wendell Berry, with whom I'm deeply sympathetic. Okay. But I don't think we can just abandon the notion of the city or the urban, because the city or the urban seems a fundamental aspect of human being and living. And then also, though, with respect to height and reaching for the heavens, you can also look at cathedrals or the pyramids, where the attainment of this height is not necessarily an expression of hubris. It isn't necessarily Babylonian. It can also be an homage or an expression of recognition of the sublimity of
Yeah.
altitude.
Man's reach should exceed his grasp, right? Else what's that?
So there's a tension there.
There is. And so what's interesting,
And
Tom, is that you read sort of a romanticization of the countryside in a lot of progressive circles. And to me, what I see is sort of the opposite trend among more authoritarian leftists who in an attempt to preserve ecologies sort of demand a very austere kind of urban living, one that's sort of marked by high rises and extreme urban density. To me,
yeah,
that almost seems more like something from the dystopia of Judge Dredd and the mega
right. So
cities.
it's the imagination of the city. And you have to say, well, what is the city?
Right. And
Okay,
so
so there's a contest
yeah,
of discourse.
yeah.
But
Yes,
yeah, you're right. See, it's not either or. Both, all of this is going on. All of this is going
yeah,
on
all of it's going on. And so
because the same people do tend to like romanticize the country, and then what they end up doing is from their little urban centers
yeah,
create legislation that is completely ridiculous and devastating for rural communities.
right.
I have a friend who talks who's in Texas, or you can go look at what's going on. Have you heard about like a new Idaho? New
No.
Idaho. So there's a secessionist movement in Washington State, if I recall correctly, and it's because is it Washington or Oregon?
I think it's Oregon. Yeah, yeah.
Oregon, sorry, in
Eastern Oregon.
Oregon.
Yeah, Eastern
And so
Oregon.
they get all these regulations in
Yeah,
terms of how they're supposed to be treating their land that are actually incredibly onerous and compromise the ability of the people on who are actually living on that land to exist and to prosper and to be farmers, right? And it's so egregious that it's that they are now trying to secede and become part of Idaho to escape these regulations that they're inheriting from the state capital, which are forged by these well-meaning liberals who are trying to protect the countryside,
yeah.
right? And that undermines what I'm saying about the city, but that doesn't have to be the city. The city is also, a fantastic place where you have the seeds of great things happening. There's energy and excitement, and it's not all bad. You can't just say, well, we're going to dissolve cities and live in the countryside. I mean, I guess if you want, you can take that tact, but I feel that would be a mistake.
Well, here's what I'll say is that I agree. I think that would be a mistake too. But I think that there still has to be an aspect of nature even in urban environments, because otherwise I feel that though we would be in strict proximity with each other, I don't think we would be convivial. I think that the natural is a key aspect
Well,
of that
less
enables
parks,
convivial life.
urban agriculture.
Exactly. And so while I agree that what I imagine is whether you call it a city, village, whatever, that it operates in harmony with its local ecology, and that one of the ways in which it almost must do is to establish a denser form of living. But I don't succumb to the thinking that must be by necessity austere. I think, and I look to the Amsterdam School of Architecture as one historical example of this, where, I mean, we don't need to get into it all, but that they were capable of constructing housing for, low-wage workers and creating buildings that housed great numbers of people. And there were also single family dwellings mixed, but they were able to include elements. And in fact, one of their one of their greatest political enablers said there's nothing too fine for the working person, is that they were able to incorporate elements of beauty and delight, and to integrate them with surrounding nature, I think in really harmonious ways. And so for me, I don't, I think that we can imagine denser spaces, urban spaces that provide more opportunities for conviviality and for actual political life to exist. But I think that there are, so Ellul talks a lot about, I wanted to get to the idea of the ethic of non-power, because I think it's essential for any reading of Lord of the Rings, where the central plot line is the idea of throwing away the object of the object of supreme power within that universe, right? And of the three prongs that Ellul talks about in the ethic of non-power, one of them is conflict. But even Ellul is careful to say, like, well, we need negotiated, controlled conflict. And I think I think one of the reasons that people are sometimes hesitant, Tom, for like public transport or for kinds of density, is that there are lots of conflicts that happen. I mean, there's the famous murder of Neely by that Marine that happened recently, right? I think it was on a subway in a subway car. And so, not all contact, I think, is going to be positive in environments that aren't, organized around the idea of conviviality. And I think part of that is to have a really healthy relationship with nature in those environments. As much as they might be communal spaces, to have that, I think, is very important for creating points of positive contact.
So, right. Well, we should probably, this is like a point at which to maybe adjourn,
Okay.
because then it opens up to like a whole other thing. But
yeah, there's way more I want to talk about this. So maybe
like even
we can have a
there,
part two.
we get into like some thwarted issues. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me. Oh, pardon me. Thwarted issues there. Yes, right. I mean, yes, nature, positive relationship, but also the category sneezes tend to come in threes, right? Excuse me. Try and limit it to two, though. But we have this notion, the sacred versus non-sacred space, or the category of the sacred, which doesn't fit neatly into our universe, right? Crime, it happens. And there's certainly things one can do to make it more or less probable. But there's a wildness to the world. Okay, I guess that's like the thing, right? There's always going to be an element of the unfortunate, and we can do what we can to try and minimize that, but we shouldn't pretend that we're ever going to eliminate it. And in fact, I don't think it should be eliminated.
I agree. I don't think that's an something to aspire to in any kind of utopia, in any kind of utopic vision, is the absence of conflict. I think it's also central to Ellul's thought that freedom is
I haven't read that particular work of his, by the way.
Yeah.
So.
But that freedom is in part always a reaction against restraints. But I agree with you. My perspective is that conflict is inevitable, but that one of the ways in which we express our freedom is by how we orient ourselves to intervene and mitigate the damage of negative conflict, right? And not all conflict is negative, but yeah, I agree on that point about not wanting to, or not aspiring to eliminate all conflict. I don't think that that's healthy or possible.
And so yeah, maybe we can pick it up there. That's like a point of
Yeah,
departure
I
next
think it's a
time.
good point of departure, and maybe we can do a part
Yeah.
two, because I don't think we didn't even get to sort of Peter Thiel, who's a Sauron defender, and the other people who defend Sauron, and you know, the as a figure of enlightenment and science, and what perspectives that
Who are these people? Okay.
yeah, I mean, this is what I'm telling you too, is that they come from different, it's weird what directions they come from. But maybe we can, that's just a little bit of a teaser. I won't give it away. But it's something I definitely want to,
And also
there's so
mystic
much
and
so much to
throwing
talk
some
about.
good ideas, huh?
There's just
Right.
so much to talk about. And like I said, I think to me, it's like the more I dove back into this, the more I realized that this is a book. I don't think anyone's really ever pursued this angle in book length form. Uh, um, there's a lot written on Tolkien for sure, but I don't know if anyone's ever pursued this. So I thought, hey, maybe this might be a good topic.
Yeah, it's a good topic, and it crosses over to other modern myths as well, right?
Yeah,
We think of Darth Vader, right? Join me, and together we can bring an end to this
maybe as a way
destructive conflict.
of plugging, or a way of finishing
Yes.
today.
Go on.
So I told you I was going to come back to this. So I don't know if you saw recently, I'm sure you did, but because of the wildfires in Canada, the air quality in Cincinnati and all across the Eastern Seaboard has been horrible. And so someone took a photo of the New York City skyline, at its sort of worst point, just sort of completely enveloped in this fog and filthy air. And the sunset was sort of hovering over a building very similar to this. And of course, the way I had or the way that the cover designer designed the book at my direction was to sort of mimic the Eye of Sauron over Barad-dûr,
Right.
with sort of having the red sun here sort of over a central building in the skyline, right? And so it was very similar. But what was
The
interesting,
villainous eye that does not sleep.
exactly. And so of course this is, and this is obviously a parody of that, right? But I think that it's an instructive, what happened though, that ecological disaster is an instructive one, I think, when we think about technique, Tom, because what happened is that they weren't actually natural forests that are being burned. They are tree plantations that have caught fire. And because the tree plantations were planted by corporations who were seeking to offset their carbon emissions. This is a market-based quote unquote solution. It doesn't work, so it's not really a solution to climate chaos. What they do is they plant these and say, look, we've planted carbon trees because they absorb carbon that offsets the carbon that we're emitting into the atmosphere here. And of course, because the powers that be, the powerful elites, don't want to disrupt the market, they accept this as pseudo solution for climate chaos. Now, what happens though is that when they plant these tree plantations, Tom, they're not real ecologies, so they don't support healthy life. They are in a lot of ways they're anti-life. They're anti-environments. They plant these trees close together. They're monoculture, so it is not a diverse ecological body. It's not a diverse ecosystem. And so because the trees are planted close together, when the fires hit, they sweep through, they hard burn, and of course, what's the ultimate outcome is that people who are already beset by air quality affected by carbon emissions are now hit with these massive fires and huge dips in air quality. And so you see that what is a proposed solution and enshrined sort of within this very perverse set of techniques for quote unquote solving climate change ends up just making things infinitely worse in this feedback loop, you know. So it's a tough note to end on, but I was struck by how similar that picture was to the cover, and so I wanted to bring that story up because I do think that it's another instructive example of what happens when technique sort of runs amok.
Art and life are intimately connected.
Yeah. But I want to talk more. There's so much more to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even 1, 2, or 3, right? It's just an unfolding conversation.
Yeah.
So we'll pick it up again here another week or two, or whatever we can manage. We
Okay.
can start with this issue of power, non-power. It all connects together. All right. I can keep going, but we'll call it. Thank you, Nick.
Of course.
And I'll talk to you here in a minute.
All right. Sounds good. Talk to you soon, Tom.
Bye.